The afternoon sky glowed an eerie orange through the dust haze as flocks of mutated locusts descended upon the last vestiges of farmland. No matter how frantically the farmers waved their makeshift torches or fired shotgun blasts into the air, the insects paid little notice. They were starved and single-minded, a living tempest that reduced healthy crops to stems and husks in minutes. It had not always been this way. A decade earlier, the development of genetically engineered insects had been heralded as the solution to world hunger, a wondrous breakthrough that would exterminate pests without toxic pesticides. For a time, it did work, until it worked too well. A glitch, an overlooked mutation, allowed them to spawn more voracious offspring, capable of devouring nearly anything remotely organic. Now they spewed across entire continents, unstoppable and hungry. From a distance, people once marveled at what they believed was a living net stretching across the skies. But soon the net darkened, grew thicker, and extended from east to west in relentless motion. Those who received advanced warnings attempted to flee the countryside, some hurrying to enclaves in the mountains or taking boats to remote islands. Others, unwilling or unable to leave the land they'd bid their entire lives to, tried in vain to salvage precious seeds and vital equipment. Towns turned into ghostly silhouettes beneath the pall of insect wings, a gloom composed not of storm clouds but of billions of chitinous bodies, scythe-like legs scraping each other in a horrifying chorus. Rumors circulated that the insects were not just living on crops. After they ravaged the fields, it was said, the plague turned to foraging among livestock, and in the most desperate areas, targeting humans themselves. Scientists tried to dismiss such tales as urban mythology, yet cattle bones stripped clean overnight, ranches found empty, and the occasional scattered remains of travelers told a darker, more menacing truth. After the brunt of the swarm swept through, only skeletal reminders of once living creatures remained. Adrian, a former agricultural technician who had worked in one of the gene editing labs, now moved from farm to farm with a grim purpose. He carried a battered metal case stuffed with worn notebooks that traced the swarm's patterns and potential vulnerabilities. Once lauded as a brilliant mind on the frontiers of entomological research, Adrian had been part of the team that enhanced these insects to eliminate the smaller pest species. He lived in guilt for his role, and was determined to find a way to stop them. Haggard and painfully gaunt from near constant hunger, Adrian trudged from settlement to settlement, offering advice and scavenging supplies. He tried to keep his background as one of the initial designers a secret, fearful that an outraged mob would string him up if they discovered he helped create the threat that had ruined their lives. His only companion was a teenage girl named Alina. She had wandered onto an abandoned research station one night, half dead from starvation. Adrian found her collapsed by an overturned water trough, with her mouth still caked in dust. In a world where every stray human strove fiercely to survive, trust was an expensive commodity. Nevertheless, he took pity on the young girl. She revived under his care, and though she never spoke much of her family, she stayed by Adrian's side. The pair developed a rough partnership. Alina's sharp eyes caught potential dangers, a nest of insects or roving bandits, while Adrian negotiated with ragtag communities. Whenever the swarms returned, they tried to find refuge in sealed bunkers or dilapidated cellars. In the quiet times, Adrian taught her how to read scientific notes and helped sharpen her survival instincts. The guilt he carried from his past deeds made him protective, determined not to fail another person. They pulled a clattering cart behind them, loaded with coils of plastic sheeting and a small generator. Adrienne insisted these items were vital for possible experiments. Alina never questioned his fascination with thick tarps and electrical wires. If Adrienne said these items could help one day reclaim the fields, then that was enough. Even if her stomach growled incessantly and a dull ache pulsated behind her eyes from thirst, hope remained a fragile thing they both clung to, a slender barrier against the suffocating gloom that clutched the landscape. One autumn evening, Adrian and Alina stood in the remains of a barn near what had once been prime farmland. The setting sun cast long shadows across scattered, crumpled tin siding and rotten wooden beams. Adjacent to the barn was a collapsed silo, its storage area wiped clean by the insects. Once, it might have held enough grain to feed dozens of families for an entire season. Now its interior was a desolation of gnawed rubble. The smell of decay and dust hung in the air. At the edge of the barn, where the farmland widened into an expanse of withered stalks, Adrian set a small device on the ground. Alina watched as he carefully checked the contraption. An old frequency emitter he'd scraped together from leftover lab equipment and parts scavenged from radios. He intended to lure a small cluster of the mutant locusts and observe their reactions. Maybe, just maybe, there was a clue in their behavior, a chink in their biological armor. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, barely audible to human ears. With the sun dipping below the horizon, Alina felt the usual spike of dread. Nighttime was when the insect's activity was most unpredictable. From somewhere beyond the scorched fields, she caught a flash of black movement, and her heart pounded. "Adrian?" she whispered, eyes locked on the horizon. He turned, tension bristling in his posture. He retrieved a small handheld sensor from his tool bag. Another relic from the labs that displayed waveforms in flickering green lines. "Let's see if they respond," he said, flipping a switch. Within seconds, the sensor beeped. Sure enough, half a dozen insects materialized near a ravaged fence row. They were bigger than ordinary locusts, each nearly the length of a human hand, and their translucent wings looked razor thin, slicing through the air with unsettling ease. Adrian crouched, fascination and fear both evident. "Hold the tarp," he instructed. Alina stepped forward with the plastic sheet, uncertain. They had rigged this contraption to harness solar energy during the day and power the emitter at night. The concept was simple. Lure a few insects in, see if the pitch disoriented them, then, maybe, design a frequency strong enough to repel or corral whole swarms. It was a small and desperate hope, but any chance for a solution outranked letting the insects multiply unchecked. The creatures fluttered closer, guided by the shrill pulses. One landed on the emitter's chassis, legs scratching at the metal plates. Adrian held his breath. A single drop of sweat trailed down his temple as he slowly twisted a knob that changed the frequency band. The locust twitched violently, its wings thrashing. For a moment, Ali thought it might tear the emitter apart, and then the insect soared away, as if unable to tolerate the disorienting pitch. A skittering sound behind them signaled that a few more were arriving from the barn's rafters. "We need to go," Alina said. The sudden influx of insects drove a surge of panic into her chest. More were converging than Adrian had predicted. He nodded, snatching the device. "We have data now. That's all we can risk." Before leaving, he made sure to detach the battery from the emitter. They retreated to a small cellar beneath the barn floor, which they had cleared just hours earlier, pulling aside rotting sacks of feed and scattered debris. Inside, they had a single lantern and scarce rations, some dried beans, soaking in a plastic bucket. As they locked the heavy door and lit the lantern, the outside droned with the rushing patter of locust wings. Adrian fiddled with his handheld sensor. A small screen lit up with lines of data, verifying that certain frequencies indeed caused discomfort to at least a few insects. It was the faintest glimmer of a solution, but a glimmer nonetheless. By dawn, the insects had vacated, leaving the ground outside stripped as though scorched by acid. The sky gray and lifeless, the farm country was a sequence of skeletons, bare trees, splintered fence posts, deflated vines. Adrian and Alina emerged from the cellar with swollen eyes from too little sleep and too much stress, but not a moment was wasted. They had to keep moving, supplies were scarce, and they needed to find a place with better shelter. Their next destination was rumored to be a battered settlement on the outskirts of what used to be a mid-sized city. They harnessed themselves to the old cart, trudging eastward. Wind raked across the fields, and overhead they heard faint chatter of insects. Some fragments of the swarm still circled like opportunistic vultures, searching for any hint of fresh vegetation or unlucky prey. Alina clutched a walking stick. She brushed her hair from her eyes, glancing at Adrian's worn face. "If we make it to that settlement, can we stay there for a while?" she asked. Her voice cracked with thirst. They had only a small canteen left. Adrian hesitated. "We can try," he said quietly. The rumor was that the settlement had built a vast greenhouse with thick, reinforced glass. How they had kept it intact during the insect onslaught remained a mystery, but many travelers claimed seeds were grown in secret, far below ground or behind triple-sealed walls. Perhaps the people there might benefit from the frequency data Adrian collected, but he feared how they would receive him if they ever discovered his past. Hours passed, and the farmland gave way to a battered highway. Cars lay jumbled on the roadside, corroded shells with windshields shattered by insects or stolen by desperate scavengers. Weeds sprouted through cracks in the pavement, brown and stiff from repeated insect feasting. Alina examined a rusted sedan, finding nothing inside but a moldy seat cushion. The sense of emptiness pressed down on them. 10 years ago, these roads would have been busy with vehicles transporting produce, materials, and families on vacation. Now, it was a graveyard. Eventually, they came across a pair of watchtowers fashioned from scaffolding, each flying tattered banners that looked like they had once been bright yellow. A voice shouted, "Halt! Who goes there?" Adrian lifted both hands, squinting in the sunlight. Two armed guards stood on either side. One had bandages around his elbows, the other a patch over her left eye. Even from a distance, Alina could see their faces, gaunt, suspicious, and exhausted in that universal way everyone had become after the apocalypse. "We're travelers seeking shelter," Adrian said. "We bring knowledge that might help with the insects." The guard with the eye patch motioned them forward. They trudged slowly, maintaining the universal sign of peace. Empty hands up, no sudden moves. The watchtowers flanked a reinforced gate made of welded scrap metal. Once the guard confirmed they had no ill intent, the gate creaked open. Through the opening, the faint smell of living vegetation wafted out, something green and fragile. Alina felt her breath catch in excitement. In that moment, her hunger pangs flared, and she clutched Adrian's arm with trembling fingers. Inside, they saw a cluster of huts and tents circled around a massive glass structure. The rumored greenhouse. A line of hungry survivors stretched from its entrance, waiting for distribution. Men, women, and a few children with hollow cheeks stood with plastic containers or tattered bags. Here and there, a small group stoked a fire, cooking watery porridge or roasting the stray beetle or rat. Adrian and Alina inhaled the thick, smoky air that mingled with the faint aroma of blossoms from within the greenhouse. It felt like entering another world, a place that defied the dryness beyond the settlement's walls. They were ushered to a makeshift courtyard by the guard with the bandaged elbows. "Speak to Gannon. He's in charge. Mind your manners. He doesn't trust strangers easily." Gannon was a wiry man, perhaps in his early 40s, but his prematurely gray hair and stern features made him seem older. His left arm was bound in a sling, the victim of what looked like a nasty bite or burn. He studied Adrian from under furrowed brows, eyes flicking to Alina. Behind him was a row of crude monitors, hooked up to battered solar panels. The faint hum of electricity pumped through cables that snaked along the dirt. Gannon signaled for them to sit on a bench made of stacked pallets. "So, you have knowledge about these insects?" he began. His accent was clipped, as if he had once been an administrator or a teacher in a previous life. "We do," Adrian replied, deliberately avoiding mention of his involvement in designing them. Instead, he said he had studied insects extensively and believed their neural pathways could be disrupted by certain frequencies. He showed Gannon the handheld sensor and a few scribbled notes. Alina's stomach rumbled, loud enough for everyone to hear. Gannon nodded to a young woman who stood near the monitors. She left and returned with a small bowl of thin stew. Alina swallowed it in great gulps, half fearing it was all a mirage. The warm feeling rushing down her throat was almost intoxicating, after days of subsisting on scraps. Gannon watched calmly, then returned his focus to Adrian. "So you want us to try building a bigger device?" Gannon said, tapping the sensor with a calloused finger. "Long that can protect our greenhouse from the swarm?" Adrian nodded. "Exactly. This settlement appears to be the last place with any chance of sustained food growth. If we can calibrate a powerful frequency emitter, we may drive the insects away when they come." Gannon's gaze sharpened. "They will come. We've had close calls already. The glass helps some, but if a swarm decides to truly swarm, it'll smash through eventually." He frowned. "We have limited resources, though, and while we have some engineers, we have no specialist in entomology or biology." Adrian took a breath. "I can help you design it," he said. "We'll need a large, stable power source, like solar panels, or a generator, and a rig to broadcast the frequency at a wide radius." He hesitated. "It might take a few attempts to get right." A moment of tension followed, the two men assessing each other. Finally, Gannon pointed to a row of battered crates near the greenhouse entrance. "You can use what we have, but if you fail, you'll have to move on, understood? We can't risk the greenhouse for an experiment that might bring the swarm crashing down on our walls." Adrian agreed, and Alina breathed a quiet sigh of relief. A chance, just a chance, to stay somewhere stable for a moment. Perhaps this settlement offered them more than just fleeting respite. They would have access to real shelter and a consistent, if meager, food source. In exchange, Adrian would try to deliver on the promise of an insect-repelling frequency. Alina glanced around at the settlement's gaunt inhabitants, sensing how much was riding on Adrian's success. Over the next several days, Adrian worked tirelessly with the settlement's small team of improvised engineers. Using salvaged metal piping and old speaker cones, they constructed a tower behind the greenhouse. Each day, while the sun was high, they tested short bursts of different frequencies. The engineers scoured battered libraries for references on wave harmonics, while Adrian pored over his notebooks, cross-referencing the insect's reaction from the barn experiment. Whenever the swarm threatened from the surrounding farmland, watchers perched atop the gate towers, sounding alarms and instructing the settlement to go into lockdown. Alina found a place among the watchers, using binoculars to scan the horizon for the telltale black haze of insect wings. The settlement's people watched Adrian's progress with growing anxiety. Rations were tight, and Gannon had enforced daily quotas on the greenhouse produce. Some residents muttered that the project was a fool's dream. Others, especially those with children, prayed for any measure of success. They knew that another major swarm could break their fragile defenses, leaving them all to starve. On the fourth evening, the watchers rang the alarm bells just after dusk. Alina bolted up the tower ladder, scanning the darkness with frantic eyes. Sure enough, there it was. A gathering swirl in the distance, a black mass crawling along the horizon like a malevolent thunderhead. The swarm was on the move. The watchers shouted for everyone to secure their doors and windows. Within minutes, the settlement was in full lockdown, the greenhouse sealed with triple-locked metal shutters. Adrian raced to the new frequency tower, hooking cables into the battered generator. "Fire it up!" he shouted to one of the engineers. The man flipped a series of switches, and the tower hummed to life. The high-pitched resonance that emerged was so sharp that many settlement dwellers clapped their hands over their ears. Adrian discounted their discomfort, wholly focused on the swarm. The swirl of insects battered against the outer sections of the wall. Guards on the ramparts used flamethrowers rigged from propane tanks to deter them, but the wave was too large to simply burn away. The locusts battered the settlement's outer fences with the sound of a rainstorm, wings snapping in collective fury. Alina, trembling, clung to the top of the watchtower. The frequency tower's whine cut through the night air, warbling in irregular patterns as Adrian searched for the right pitch. Suddenly the swarm parted, swirling upward like a black tornado. A significant fraction seemed to recoil, scattering away, yet the rest kept pressing, only partially repelled. Alina could see sections of the fence sagging under the onslaught. The shrill squeal from the frequency tower pulsed again, and those insects on the fence trembled as if in pain, flying this way and that, disorganized. Encouraged, the guards launched more flamethrower bursts. The linemen used long metal rods to reinforce weak sections of the fence. Eventually, the swarm broke apart, rising back into the night sky in chaotic tumult. Dust and bits of shredded wings rained down on the settlement. When the last echoes of insect wings faded, the settlement exhaled in collective relief. While not all insects had been driven away immediately, the device had disrupted the swarm's mass cohesion and forced the majority out of range. They had survived. Cheers broke out, though the jubilation was tinged with sobering acknowledgement that the respite might be temporary. Adrian leaned against the tower, chest heaving. For once he allowed himself the faintest smile. They had a start, an invention that might be improved, refined to encompass a broader area. Over the following weeks, the frequency tower was improved upon, shaped into a more sophisticated array. Adrian worked with the settlement's handful of electronic specialists, adjusting sine waves, boosting amplitude, testing new combinations. Each day they observed smaller insect clouds and measured how effectively the device repelled them. The results were promising. Repeated swarms refused to approach the walls when the tower was active, giving the settlement crucial breathing room. In that time, greenhouse production increased. More seeds were introduced into the hidden sublevel gardens. The morale in the settlement lifted. When children emerged to play for a moment, one could almost forget the horrors lurking beyond the walls. Each evening, Alina joined the watchers in the tower or assisted with greenhouse tasks. At night, she and Adrian slept in a cramped storeroom near the power generator. The whir of the device they had helped install was a constant reminder of fragile safety. On the edges of her dreams, Alina would hear the rustling wings and scraping exoskeletons, seeing black clouds that devoured everything. She would jolt awake, heart hammering. Adrian would place a hand on her shoulder, offering silent reassurance. In time, Gannon acknowledged Adrian's achievements and invited him to join the settlement's council. The older man, initially so guarded, showed a cautious respect. "You and I, we're both doing what we must to keep people alive," Gannon told him once, his voice quiet. "I'm not much for thanks, but no, you've done well here." Despite these small victories, Adrian could not shake his guilt. Each time he saw children rummaging for scraps or heard the moan of an elderly person weakened by hunger, he recalled the excitement of the labs, the day they had introduced the genetically modified insects into carefully controlled fields. The memory stung like an open wound. None of his old colleagues had predicted the insect's capacity for unstoppable reproduction. Adrian had tried too late to propose stronger containment measures, but by that point, corporate interests were propelling the product into distribution. Profits and accolades overshadowed warnings, and now the product of that misguided ambition was scouring the earth. He confided some of his regrets to Alina one night as they sat by the greenhouse door, listening to the quiet hum of pollinating bees the settlement had painstakingly protected. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." Alina, frowning slightly, rested her chin on her knees. "I'd be dead if you hadn't taken me in," she replied. "You're trying to fix things now. That's what matters." She reached out and squeezed his hand gently. The next day, Adrian resolved to push the technology further. If the frequency tower could repel the insects from a small settlement, there might be a way to expand that protective barrier. Maybe entire swaths of farmland could be reclaimed if they found the resources, or if other pockets of survivors replicated the design. Over a hearty breakfast of cornbread, an incredible luxury in this famine, Adrian explained his vision to Gannon. "We need to broadcast these plans," he said. "Transmit them by radio to any enclaves that might still have power to replicate the frequency tower. It's our best shot at fighting back on a broader scale." Gannon mulled it over. "We've got an old shortwave station. The antenna's battered, but it might still work if you can scrounge enough parts." He narrowed his gaze. "But expect others to come, seeking refuge or resources. We can barely support ourselves. Spreading knowledge means we'll be a target." "That's a risk," Adrian admitted, "but the alternative is letting the insects keep spreading, ensuring none of us survive. If more communities build a network of towers, the insects might be driven off entire regions." Ultimately, Gannon agreed, albeit reluctantly. The settlement's engineers got to work, restoring the abandoned shortwave station. Over days, they spliced wires, tested old transmitters, and carefully typed up instructions for building the disruptor array. What frequencies to use, how to assemble the power couplings, how to calibrate wave harmonics. Adrian's words and diagrams would travel as far as the radio waves could carry them. At last, the day came for the broadcast. Settlement inhabitants gathered around the station as the final connections were made. Some had tears in their eyes, remembering the era of electronic communication as if it were a distant dream. Gannon gave Adrian the nod, and the microphone clicked on. In a measured, calm tone, Adrian spelled out the blueprint. To anyone listening, we have found a method to repel the genetically engineered insects. You'll need a stable power source, a frequency generator, and broadcast equipment. The steps are as follows. His voice traveled beyond the settlement's walls into the winds and across the broken landscape. Many listened in silence, hearts pounding with hope. Even if they couldn't be sure how many enclaves remained, or who might be scanning the frequencies, they knew that passing along the knowledge was their last best shot at saving lives beyond their own gates. When Adrian finished, Gannon put a hand on his shoulder. "We've done what we can," the settlement leader said quietly. In the following weeks, the settlement strengthened its walls and built additional greenhouses. With the frequency tower running, more seeds were planted in the rejuvenated soil. Using compost made from gathered organic waste and the few livestock that had made it through the plague, they coaxed new life out of the ground. Bean plants, squash, even a few hardy fruit trees in a specially protected orchard. A sense of absolute desperation loosened its grip on the people. They were still a far cry from plenty, but they saw the beginnings of a future they had believed lost forever. As for Adrian, he continued refining the repellent frequencies, setting up smaller towers around the outskirts. He taught Alina everything he knew about wave modulation and insect biology. Occasionally, travelers limped through the gates, some of them clutching crumpled pages with the tower schematics, saying they had heard the broadcast. People started speaking of small farmland patches springing back to life in other regions, stabilized by newly built towers. From pockets around the continent, a few voices crackled over the radio, confirming that they too had experienced success in pushing back the swarms, albeit gradually, but the fight was far from over. Though their settlement enjoyed more peaceful nights, storms of insects still drifted across the plains, unstoppable to anyone without a functioning tower. Food shortages and disease-ravaged remote areas and trade routes remained fraught with danger. Each time a new group arrived, they brought further stories of devastation, half-eaten towns, survivors besieged, entire herds of livestock decimated. Yet each one also held a kernel of stubborn resolve. Humanity, battered and starved, was beginning to unite against the threat. In the final days of that year, the settlement gathered for a harvest meal. The greenhouse and orchard had yielded enough produce for modest portions of vegetables and even a few rare apples. The makeshift cafeteria bustled with conversation. Laughter broke out when a child squealed in delight at tasting a sweet piece of apple for the first time in her life. Adrian found a seat with Alina near the edge of the room, content to watch the renewal of hope. Alina took a bite of roasted squash, savoring its modest sweetness, and looked at Adrian. "Do you think this is enough to stop them for good?" she asked, her expression a mix of optimism and lingering fear. He exhaled. "It's a start," he said, recalling the continuous improvements that needed to be made to the towers, the seeds that needed planting, the communities that needed to build alliances and share resources. "We can't undo everything that's happened, but we can fight for what remains. And maybe, in time, humanity can heal." Gannon passed by and set a hand briefly on Adrian's shoulder, then moved on to speak with another group. Outside the cafeteria, the faint hum of the frequency tower throbbed, a guardian melody protecting the fragile bubble of life within the walls. In the distance, sometime later that night, they heard the drone of approaching insects. But the swarm, confronted by the high-pitched barrier, veered away in agitated confusion. No longer unstoppable, no longer an inevitable wave of devastation. Adrian listened to the diminishing roar, and for the first time since he had escaped the labs, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps the human race, though battered, still had a fighting chance. He and Alina returned to their small room beneath the settlement ramparts, the stuttering glow of an electric lantern guiding them through narrow corridors. Outside, the protective hum persisted, coursing through cables and steel towers, a fragile bulwark against the engineered plague. While the night air remained thick with tension, there was now a space for hope. It wasn't the world Adrian had once known, but in a land plagued by ravenous insects, the mere chance for regrowth, for living plants and families who might rebuild, felt like a miracle. And in this testament to human resilience, they held on, determined to endure and to starve no more in the jaws of the swarm.